It's the First World War. Soldiers would fight to gain inches of progress and die to protect it. In between fighting, they had a lot of downtime sitting in the trenches trying not to think about running out across no man's land. One soldier would spend his time learning how to play with cards and was pretty fantastic at it. He created tricks we use today and was influential and well regarded. He would call himself the Houdini of cards, or Cardini for short. His great-nephew would take a lot of the concepts of Cardini's card tricks and use them in his own career, first in magic and then in gaming. And if you haven't quite figured it out already, Cardini's name was Richard Pitchford, and his descendant is Randy Pitchford. Magic is incredibly important to Randy Pitchford, and he spent most of his early years doing magic for a living in Hollywood, selling magic in gift shops and working in the industry. At the same time, he was fascinated by video games, spending time breaking down games like Colossal Cave Adventure in order to learn how they worked using BASIC, a computer coding language that you can build a game in even today. It's no surprise then that he would apply for and be hired by 3D Realms, the new sub-brand of Apogee Software, publishers of Wolfenstein 3D and Rise of the Triad. The very first game he would work on was Duke Nukem 3D, the first 3D entry into the Duke Nukem franchise released in 1996. Duke 3D was a huge success, taking all of the ideas from Apogee's former partner id Software and developing a brand new iconic style of first-person shooter. Duke would go on to inspire other light-hearted, not-so-serious shooters like Redneck Rampage and Blood. After the success of Duke Nukem, 3D Realms split their team into two to start working on Duke Nukem Forever and Shadow Warrior. Randy would work on Shadow Warrior, another light-hearted, comedy-centric shooter with lots of jokes and a very talkative protagonist, going directly against the grain of games like Doom and its more serious clones. Before Shadow Warrior was officially released, Randy would leave 3D Realms and join Rebel Boat Rocker, a company started by the Zelznak brothers, who were responsible for dreaming up the Duke Nukem follow-up Bombshell. Following along with Randy were several other developers from 3D Realms. Rebel Boat Rocker worked on one game, Prax War, a first-person shooter with vehicles, outdoor segments, and a squad of friendly characters. Prax War had some interesting ideas, most notably that they wanted to be able to include a lot of the third-person animations seen in games such as Tomb Raider and Mario 64, without the control issues inherent in that style of game, leading to the idea of a squad of characters that would operate independently from the player, but would be able to do a lot of scripted actions, so that the player could still see those cool third-person animations, but could retain the fine-tuned controls of first-person. Prax War was intended to be published by EA, but another game would be released while Rebel Boat Rocker was working.
Rise and shine, Mr. Freeman.
Half-Life. Half-Life did all the things that Prax War would do, and it did them successfully. Half-Life remains one of the most awarded games of all time, and EA decided to pull the plug for missing the technology window. Prax War wasn't a bad game, and it didn't miss milestones, it just couldn't compete with the new big bad on the market. If you've been sitting here saying, Rebel Boat Rocker is a weird name for a studio, the reasoning is simple. Scott Miller, founder of Apogee, thought that Billy Zelznak was a rebel and a boat rocker for planting the seeds of discontent. And this wasn't the kind of statement that had a whole lot of good feelings behind it. Zelznak's constant lobbying for better treatment of developers led to a large portion of 3D Realms leaving and forming Hypnotic Entertainment, the company that would eventually become Ritual Entertainment, the makers of Sin and Legacy of Kain: Defiance. Miller was very upset that Pitchford and the others had left 3D Realms. And in fact, 3D Realms sued Rebel Boat Rocker for trademark infringement just a year before Prax War was shut down. To add salt to the wound, Miller's response to the Prax War cancellation was, "Row, row, row your boat. Our game is but a dream." While he would later recant this, saying it was unfair to revel in the loss of so many jobs, Pitchford would not forget this. And so, we finally come to the beginning. It's 1999, and Randy Pitchford, his friends and co-workers are out of work, demoralized by their losses, belittled by their former employer, and with years of man-hours spent working on something that will never be seen by any gamer. Rebel Rebel Boat Rocker was run in a revolutionary way, in that every single employee was a full share owner of the company. This meant that no one was in charge. They were all collaborative and working together as equals. Their failure was impressed upon Randy, who decided they needed to have a boss. Someone who could lay down the law, trim the fat, and set deadlines. Pitchford had already been the lead developer. He'd been the lead level designer and the PR contact. He was young and ambitious and very, very egotistical, and as such knew that he would be the perfect boss. Contacting his former co-workers and turning down all other job offers, they formed Gearbox Software in February of 1999. It was important that they had a hierarchy, and so the 5 co-founders agreed that Randy would be the director and president of the company. Randy decided this time they wouldn't worry about developing their own tech or having massive R&D, but instead would reach out and work on other people's technology. One of the companies at the top of their list was Valve Corporation, who had produced the Half-Life game that had helped to put them out of work in the first place. In fact, Randy's appreciation for Valve's work is so well known that he actually tells a completely false story about winning the name of Gearbox from Gabe Newell, the founder of Valve, in a poker tournament, a 1v1 poker tournament on a riverboat, where the loser had to be the Valve and the winner was the powerful Gearbox. There's no denying the names have a similar theme to them. This story, while completely false, shows that Pitchford has a flair for the dramatic at the very least. Valve listened to their pitch, which was unique. Instead of simply producing a Duke Nukem-esque map pack with a few more levels to run around in, Gearbox would produce a wholly new story taking place in the Half-Life universe, but from the perspective of another character. Valve loved the idea, but they didn't wholly own Half-Life, so they sent Pitchford to go convince their publisher, Sierra Entertainment, one of the original and most successful publishers in the industry. Sierra said yes. Half-Life Opposing Force would be the story of Adrian Shepard, one of the Marines sent to eliminate the main character from Half-Life. It featured outdoor segments and a squad of friendly characters who did scripted animations in front of the player, mimicking the original goals of Prax War. In fact, the similarities between Rebel Boat Rocker's goals for Prax War and the product delivered by Gearbox in OP4 are incredibly striking. It shouldn't be surprising that the team, which had spent years working on their own very similar game, would deliver a stellar title, very well regarded by critics and gamers alike. The only real complaint anyone had was that it was too short, and that's the kind of complaint developers like to hear. OP4 was my personal favorite as well. I have fond memories of being on the forums months before the game was released, actively pitching new ideas and discussing every single piece of news for weeks. After the success of Opposing Force, Gearbox was signed on for another similar title, Blue Shift. Following the basic premise set by OP4, Blue Shift would follow another character during the same period as Half-Life, this time from the eyes of Barney the security guard. It too would sell well enough, though with more complaints this time about short gameplay and the overall repetitive feel to the game. This is when Gearbox shifted their approach from making games into making ports with new content. Pitchford had grown annoyed by the slow, methodical process of Valve. He wanted to ship games quicker and iterate on new ideas. He told Vox Games, "It is not about making the perfect thing. It is about sharing something that we've created with the world and getting feedback from that." They would start with, appropriately enough, Half-Life, producing a PlayStation 2 port with new content. That new content was, also highly appropriately, the story of Half-Life from the eyes of a new protagonist. Half-Life Decay was also a cooperative shooter, a game where the player would work together with a partner to traverse the puzzles. Gearbox would port Half-Life and Blue Shift to the Dreamcast, work with Valve on Counter-Strike, and do a large portion of Counter-Strike Condition Zero as well. They started reaching out to console games and porting those to PC, such as Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3, James Bond 007 Nightfire, and Halo Combat Evolved. It wouldn't be until 2005 that they released their own game again, and they came out of the gate swinging. The game they released was so well regarded and sold so well that gamers who have never heard of Gearbox know about Brothers in Arms. Selling over 1.7 million copies in its first month, Brothers in Arms Road to Hill 30 was called near perfection and one of the best World War II gaming experiences. receiving 10 out of 10s and an average of 9 out of 10 almost across the board. It's included in more than a few Best World War II Games lists, from Game Rant to Watch Mojo, and Philip Morton of Thunderbolt called it, without a doubt, the best World War II game ever made. Brothers in Arms was not a traditional World War shooter. It didn't glamorize war, and it was not afraid to be realistic and emotional. It doesn't have run-and-gun segments. You're not Rambo, and tactical thinking is important. In fact, it takes a lot from games like XCOM here, and you often find yourself pinning enemies down with suppressive fire while flanking for a clear shot. An immersive feel was paramount, and there was no music whatsoever during gameplay. Instead, the quiet moments are only ever punctuated by gunshots and screams, whether your teammates or the enemies. It is a shining example of history done correctly by games, even telling the story of real soldiers and their real experiences, complete with photos of the actual locations and soldiers in the platoons. That it is compared to Band of Brothers and Saving Private Ryan is no surprise. This game, too, has a lot of similarities to Prax War, and it feels, perhaps only in hindsight, as though this was the game they intended to make all along. And it's not unfair to say that the industry took notice of their innovations. BioWare games like Mass Effect and Dragon Age, Jagged Alliance Back in Action, and Fallout Tactics all use the Road to Hill 30 implementation of real-time with pause or tactical pausing. An interesting side note here, Brothers in Arms was originally contracted by Activision to produce Brothers in Arms as a competitor to Medal of Honor. At the last second, Microsoft came in and offered a higher marketing budget if they agreed to port it to the Xbox. This reversal upset Activision.
We don't want to look at, someone who's just making a crappy war game,
who would poach a lot of the staff from Medal of Honor to make their own game, Call of Duty. Gearbox would take the few complaints about Road to Hill 30 and produce Brothers in Arms Earned in Blood the same year, releasing barely 6 months later to lesser but still very high praise. The game was essentially a level pack with some bug fixes, which irked a lot of critics, but gamers didn't really care. The core concept was too good to be upset that they were given more of what they asked for. Gearbox would fall back into their old ways at this point, however, and they produced 3 more Brothers in Arms games that were essentially ports with additional content. D-Day for the PlayStation Portable, DS for the Nintendo DS, and Double Time for the Wii and macOS, all of which were some variation of the original games on new platforms. One last Brothers in Arms would be produced by Gearbox, Brothers in Arms Hell's Highway, the third and final installation in the original trilogy. There's very little to say about this game, but it's interesting to look at for the additions that Gearbox made. The gameplay itself is almost identical to the previous 2, even with the 3 years since Earned in Blood was released. However, Hell's Highway followed the industry trend of dumbing down features for more widespread accessibility. Gone is the situational awareness system, and instead there is a tactical map. Regenerating health shows up, and a slow-motion glory kill camera is added. This Brothers in Arms is also the first Gearbox title to ever include a collector's edition available for pre-order. Gearbox would also work with Sonic Team and Sega to produce a port of Samba de Amigo for the Wii in 2008, again falling on their experience providing expanded port versions of games to add in features that were not available on other platforms. Most small game companies only ever have one huge success, and Gearbox almost certainly never thought they'd achieve the success they saw with Road to Hill 30 again. They might match it or slightly exceed, but certainly never completely leave it behind. Even today, Double Fine is the Psychonauts developer. From Software is the Dark Souls developer. However, the next game that Gearbox would release would completely overshadow every game they'd ever produced. Randy Pitchford wanted to make a hybrid shooter, something that wasn't a Prax War design document leftover. He enjoyed Diablo, and being a game developer who made first-person shooters, it wasn't long before he thought about putting the looting mechanics of Diablo into a shooter. This was a risky move. The industry did not believe that people wanted these sort of hybrid features in their games. In fact, Michael Pachter, arguably the most influential analyst in the video game industry even today, believe that such an idea was a failure from the start. If you want a role-playing game, you play an RPG. If you want a shooter, you play a shooter. You don't play a game that takes a few pieces from both. Of course, many years later, Pachter would admit he was completely wrong, since that game was Borderlands. Borderlands is an incredibly successful title. You've heard of this game. It sold well on PlayStation, PC, Xbox, even Apple. This is one of the big games of the 2000 to 2010 decade and started a franchise that today is the 65th best-selling game franchise of all time. It's 35th on IGN's Top 100 Modern Video Games and won several Game of the Year awards. Borderlands catapulted Gearbox into the list of AAA developers almost overnight. Yes, OP4 was a success, but it was Valve's success. Yes, Brothers in Arms was a success, but it was Ubisoft's success. Borderlands was wholly Gearbox's success, even if it included Take-Two's publisher tag before it. Borderlands was unique and cool. It was a cooperative shooter you could put dozens or hundreds of hours into with your friends. It had started as a muddy brown game, but found its identity through the use of cell shading. Though that decision certainly wasn't without controversy all by itself. The art style, world design, and even the introduction to the game was almost plagiaristically taken from a short film called Code Hunters. Character designs from the film show up on an almost one-to-one basis, and it's incredibly hard not to say that Code Hunters was a core inspiration when the creator of the film, Ben Hibben, states that he was contacted by Gearbox to work on the game. This was the first controversy that Randy Pitchford would have to address, as Hibben was not very happy. He told Gather Your Party, a now defunct game news site, "To be absolutely clear, I have never created or designed anything for Gearbox or Borderlands. Gearbox saw my work and decided to reproduce it, make it their own, without my help or my consent. The hardest part for me when this happened was understanding why they wouldn't ask me directly. We were already talking about doing some work together, and it made no sense." Pitchford's official response didn't do much. If anything, he seemed to ignore the claims entirely. He told Kotaku, "It was inspiring to me when The Incredibles was clearly a big source of influence for titles like Battlefield Heroes and Team Fortress 2 and other amazing games and media. Perhaps with more attention from gaming news sites and other sources, Code Hunters can be more respected and honored for their innovation and leadership in CG as well. But to the world at large, this was a non-issue." Borderlands was fun and different, groundbreaking even, and what's a little bit of innocent inspiration. It launched publisher 2K Games into top 10 game publishers lists. And for many people, Borderlands was the best co-op game you could find. A few months later, Gearbox would shock the gaming world when attendees to E3 2010 walked over to Take-Two's booth to find a sign for the most infamous piece of vaporware in the gaming industry, Duke Nukem Forever. Better still, there was a playable demo. A lot of information about Duke Nukem Forever only came out much later, and perhaps some of the stories we know now slightly forgives Gearbox, but to say that Duke Forever was poorly received is an understatement. You might recall that after working on Duke 3D way back in 1996, and before Randy would leave to join Rebel Boat Rocker, 3D Realms had decided to split their development team into two to work on Shadow Warrior and Duke Nukem Forever. Here we were, 14 years and 44 days later, and the game was finally released. 3D Realms had entered a level of development hell previously unheard of. Forever would show up randomly throughout the years with a new trailer here or there, showing the newest iteration of the game on the latest game engines. After 12 years with no discernible movement, 3D Realms laid off most of their staff. They had contracted with Take-Two to publish the game, and Take-Two's response to this round of layoffs was to file a lawsuit for failure to complete the project. Randy, hearing about these issues, decided to step in and contacted 3D Realms to make a purchase of the Duke Nukem brand. They agreed, and Gearbox went to their publisher, also Take-Two, and came to an agreement to drop the lawsuit against 3D Realms in an understanding that Gearbox would now finish and release the game. Take-Two loved Gearbox. They just produced Borderlands after all, and they were a game company known for shipping products. The lawsuit was dropped, the game was released, and the reviews started to roll in. 3 out of 10, 2 out of 10, 1 star. The game was a complete dud. That's not to say it didn't sell, though nowhere near what Take-Two hoped to see. This time, when Michael Pachter said that the game would sell half of what it was expected to do, he was right. Gearbox managed to stay mostly unscathed by Duke Nukem's failure by placing most of the blame on Scott Miller and 3D Realms. Randy was able to pivot the story and say, "Forever radically exceeded my expectation. So that's why to my stupid, unobjective eyes, it was amazing. But to everyone expecting the greatest game ever, it was rubbish." And there's a certain amount of leeway given to Gearbox and Randy in particular for being willing to even pick up such a broken title and attempt to fix and deliver it after 14 years of failures. On top of the fact that the game was primarily coded by a core group of former 3D Realms employees, working as an internal development house named Triptych Games. Regardless, Gearbox made people forget about Duke Nukem fast enough when it announced that it was working on a new Aliens game and the upcoming Borderlands 2. As a tie-in to their upcoming Alien game, Gearbox would co-develop Alien Infestation, a 2D side-scrolling Metroidvania for the Nintendo DS. After their experiences with managing Triptych Games, they decided to contract with an independent outside developer, WayForward Technologies. WayForward had been in the industry as coders for hire since 1990, working primarily as developers of licensed games, such as Shrek, Ogres, and Dronkies. The game everyone really cared about, of course, was Borderlands 2, a sequel to one of the most popular PC shooters in the past several years. Released on September 18th, 2012, Borderlands 2 was an instant success and had incredibly strong marketing efforts. Gearbox worked with Telltale Games to include Claptrap in their Poker Night 2, unlocking Borderlands 2 content for completing objectives in the game. There was a comic book miniseries and later series released by IDW and written by Mikey Newman that showed the backstory of the main characters. There was a season pass for DLC available, a marketing product that Take-Two had pioneered on their game LA Noire the year before. Borderlands 2 had 2 physical collector's editions at different price points with DLC, bobbleheads, art books, and more. It released on digital download through the PlayStation Network the day it was released, and was available for preload on Steam. And all of this worked. Borderlands 2 became the best-selling game in 2K's history. Not long after release, however, Randy was back on the defensive. This time they weren't accused of stealing their entire art direction, just plain old stealing art. Ollie Moss, a visual designer who had produced licensed work for Star Wars, noticed that part of the artwork included with Borderlands 2 looked somewhat familiar. At first it felt like an homage, more harmless inspiration, until a Twitter user sent Ollie a version of the 2 artworks that clearly showed theft of assets. That, along with the clear inspiration, led Randy to admitting that they had stolen artwork from Moss and apologizing. This, of course, isn't a huge problem in and of itself. It's not impossible that an intern simply made a mistake in the final hours of crunch, but it does start to show a pattern when combined with the Code Hunters controversy from Borderlands 1. Shortly after that, Eurogamer would interview lead designer John Hemingway about one of the upcoming DLC characters, the Mechromancer. During the interview, he would refer to one of the skill trees as the girlfriend mode. This skill tree would essentially include easy mode items, such as aiming assistance, better regeneration with low health, higher damage resistance, and skills that buff your ally. On its own, this Best Friends Forever skill tree is completely fine and is a legitimate choice for any gamer who may not be particularly skilled, but it was Hemingway's depiction of this as a girlfriend mode for someone who sucks at first-person shooters, a skill tree that allows them to understand the game. Randy would spin this as a personal anecdote and state that the skill tree makes it easier for less skilled co-op partners of any gender to play and be useful. But the internet wasn't done with Gearbox, and lead writer Anthony Birch was being called out for having written a racist character with his dialogue for Tiny Tina. Mike Sacco, a contractor working on Activision Blizzard's World of Warcraft trading card game, sent a tweet stating that Tiny Tina's dialogue made him feel uncomfortable due to the racial connotation associated with Ebonics and a lot of the specific words the character used in her dialogue. Randy had to wade into the fray to defend Birch, a well-known instigator on social media drama. Finally, Gearbox managed to upset the internet one more time when it was revealed that their Season Pass didn't include all the DLC. This was further exacerbated when it was revealed the Game of the Year edition, which was supposed to include all content, also did not include some DLC. Meanwhile, Gearbox released another handheld game, this time for iOS, again by handing over their work to another developer, 2K China. This habit of moving their work to other developers would come back to haunt them very, very soon. In 2006, Sega had announced they'd gotten the rights to the Alien franchise, and they started 2 games since then. One an RPG from Obsidian Entertainment, who you will know as the developers of Neverwinter Nights 2, Fallout New Vegas, and South Park The Stick of Truth. This game was cancelled, and rumors in the industry suggest that the reason it was cancelled was to move funding over to the other game being developed by Gearbox, Aliens Colonial Marines. It's interesting how many of Gearbox's games fall into the category of infamous, and Colonial Marines is one of the most infamous. The story around the development of this game is absolutely massive and could easily fill multiple videos all by itself. But it can be broken down like this. Gearbox wanted to focus on Borderlands 2, so as they'd done so many other times, they farmed out the work to other developers. This time, instead of just one developer, they brought on several. Demiurge Studios, a company Gearbox had worked with to handle some of the Brothers in Arms ports and best known for the Mass Effect PC port, worked on the multiplayer. Nerve Software, the company who did the multiplayer for Return to Castle Wolfenstein, designed the multiplayer maps, and Timegate Studio, who had worked on the expansion packs for Fear and also worked on a game series called Section 8, was going to take over primary responsibility for the actual game itself. When it was released, it was lambasted by critics, reviewers, and gamers alike. It was unfinished, poorly optimized, buggy, sometimes unplayable, with incredibly poor graphics, and an enemy AI that was described as barely there. We'll touch back on that later since there's a lot of irony associated with that complaint. And here, we start getting into convoluted stories, many of which are hard to verify as they're locked behind legal decisions stemming from several lawsuits. Timegate, upon being given the contract, stated there was no game to work on. There was obviously not 4 years of work done on the game, one source told Jason Schreier from Kotaku. They were handed an uncoordinated group of assets and the lighting shader from the original Borderlands. That was the sole contribution of Gearbox up until that point. The first problems started showing up when Timegate realized one of the things they hadn't been handed was a story. There was no final script, it would be changed randomly and on the fly, leading to entire levels and huge segments of the game being tossed out entirely. Then, beyond just having 3 separate developers working on 3 separate parts of the game, there was also the extra overhead of having to please both Gearbox and Sega. Sega was pushing for a Call of Duty-esque feeling to the game, and Gearbox was pushing them to make a game about killing aliens. That friction between Gearbox, Timegate, and Sega was exacerbated by the completely different management styles between Timegate and Gearbox, who, by all reports, did not work together harmoniously at all. And Gearbox's relationship with Sega was no better. An anonymous Sega employee wrote in a now-deleted Reddit thread that Gearbox misappropriated the $30 million that Sega had given them, using it to fund the purchase of the Duke Nukem Forever franchise, and to bolster their own staff for Borderlands and Borderlands 2. A second anonymous staffer would corroborate these claims, saying, "Our team was getting smaller by the month, making it very difficult to get the game made. Ironically, several of the team members were ex-3D Realms people who were saying, 'Finally, we're going to Gearbox to make Aliens.'" Sega wasn't completely unaware of this either, and they cancelled the game in 2008, leading to layoffs at Gearbox. But Randy was able to convince Sega to give them a second chance. That second chance appears to have hinged on the E3 demo that was revealed to gamers in 2012. This demo was, eventually, used as evidence in a class action lawsuit against Sega and Gearbox, where Sega paid $1.25 million in settlement a year later. The lawsuit was brought on because because this demo shown at E3 did not and does not compare to the actual gameplay that players were able to experience when the game was released. There were significant graphical differences between the two products, and it was argued that Sega engaged in false advertising by showing a game that was clearly not what was actually delivered. Gearbox's defense, which ultimately paid off, was that they just made the game, they didn't do the marketing. Randy said, "Whenever they make trailers, they always use the PC version. But it's kind of a trick, the fact that PC content is used to market the game when there's different versions. I don't do it. I'm not a publisher. I'm a developer. I'm not actually responsible for any marketing." And quite frankly, there is a legitimate argument that perhaps this was all Sega's doing, as Sega had now sunk tens of millions of dollars and multiple years into this project. Sega was aware the money had been siphoned off to work on other projects, and they wanted to see a return on their investment no matter what. In fact, Randy's explanation on why Gearbox wouldn't purposefully lead someone astray rings somewhat true. He said, "Pre-orders for that game were sub-150,000 units global, about 130,000 units. The game ended up selling 1.5 million. The pre-orders are less than 10%, and if you build bad will, you have no hope of a tail. So any strategy that's predicated on that is a failed strategy before it begins." Considering all of the problems associated with it, it's not too hard to believe that Sega would simply attempt to transfer the debt from Gearbox to the consumer, since their contract simply stated that Gearbox only had to make the game. The thing is, they didn't make the game, they supervised the game, and it was given to a developer who never should have had primary development duties. Years later, a modder would find a single typo in the code. The word tether was misspelled with an A, making it teether. This single typo just happened to be in the part of the code that attached the AI to the aliens, leading to the complaint about poor AI in the original game. This in and of itself isn't a horrible mistake. Firaxis released Civilization 6 with a typo in their behavioral AI that led to poor resource management, but it was this AI typo on top of all the other bugs, the marketing lies, and the overall negative reception to the game that made it unforgivable. Timegate would shut down, partially because of this, not the typo specifically, but the overall reception to the game. It was their last game. One of their staff would go on to say, "The game feels like it was made in 9 months. That's because it was." Randy Pitchford took most of the credit for the failure of this game. He never threw Timegate under the bus directly, but he made sure to talk about how he wasn't throwing them under the bus frequently enough that it was clear he felt Gearbox really didn't have any responsibility for Colonial Marines. Every interview he did would say something along the lines of, "I'm not saying it was outsourcing's fault, it was Gearbox's fault because we were supervising it." Around this same time, Duke Nukem Forever would rear its ugly head once again. One of the conditions in the sale of Duke Nukem Forever to Gearbox was that 3D Realms had the right to finish the Duke Nukem game that they were already working on. That game, Duke Nukem Survivor, was never finished, but they had contracted a new game called Duke Nukem Mass Destruction with a third-party developer and simply said, "This is Survivor." It's not unsurprising that Gearbox did not approve, since they were the sole trademark owners of Duke Nukem at that point, and they sued 3D Realms. There was no love lost between the two companies. As you'll recall, Scott Miller, the CEO of 3D Realms, was the one to call Randy and his co-founders boat-rocking rebels, and who also gleefully celebrated when their game Prax War was cancelled by EA. Gearbox assaulted 3D Realms, completely humiliating them at every turn, and even required a handwritten apology from Scott Miller. Additionally, Miller was replaced as the CEO. While we'll probably never know what happened in the courts, we do know that afterwards, 3D Realms gave up all rights to Duke Nukem. A few months later, an unintended consequence of this complete turnover of the brand would see the relationship with Devolver Digital ended, Devolver being the publisher on Steam of Duke Nukem 3D Megaton Edition. When this relationship was ended, Gearbox absorbed the final month of profits, waiting to go to Devolver. Now, Devolver wasn't upset about this, but Richard Gobeil, an independent programmer, was. He had written some code for the game and was given residuals by Devolver every month. He is disabled and was the sole caretaker of his sick wife. Most of his income was tied directly to this Duke Nukem release. Now, the problem isn't so much that they decided to pull the game. They'd bought the rights, they can go ahead and remove the game from sale. And it's not even so much that they took the profit from Devolver and therefore took Richard's dividends as well. The problem is that Richard had a licensing contract allowing him to sell the game. In theory, Gearbox took over the responsibility for honoring that license when they took over the ownership of the Duke Nukem brand. However, the license and emails were all signed by Scott Miller. This might even have been forgiven, but Gearbox refused to discuss any details about the settlement for the Duke Nukem ownership unless Richard signed an NDA. However, he decided instead to go public, and Gearbox decided to go legal. It was Randy Pitchford's belief that 3D Realms did not have the right to offer that license in the first place, and if Gobeil wouldn't play ball, then he was going to sue. From an outsider's perspective, however, this seems needlessly cruel. Why sue a disabled man with no income? The unfortunate answer is equally cruel. While suing 3D Realms to prove that the license was sold erroneously would cost time and money, suing someone who can't fight back is cheaper. Throughout this, Randy was, to say the least, exceptionally uncaring in public, going so far as to tweet, "Your license is not real. That's a bummer for you." Eventually, Gobeil would give up and accept a contracting job at Gearbox, and was even gracious enough to say that he didn't blame Gearbox or the current owner of 3D Realms. It's very clearly implied that he did blame Scott Miller. For the next several years, Gearbox didn't really produce anything. They worked with 2K Australia to write Borderlands the pre-sequel in 2014, 2K Australia formerly being a part of Irrational Games and working on titles like BioShock, BioShock 2, and BioShock Infinite. After working on the pre-sequel, 2K Australia was shut down. At the time, it was the last AAA developer left in Australia. Gearbox worked with Telltale Games to help them produce Tales from the Borderlands. Tales was one of people's favorite games when talking about Telltale's history, but it didn't sell particularly well. A few years later, Telltale would also shut down. There's a lot of interesting stuff around Telltale's history, and if you're interested in knowing more about that, you can click the card in the upper right-hand corner to see a video about what led to the death of Telltale. Next up, they went back to their oldest habits and produced a ported version of Borderlands 2 and Borderlands the pre-sequel, titled The Handsome Collection. In contrast to their earlier days, they hired 2 other studios to handle the actual port. Iron Galaxy Studios, the creators of Divekick, and Armature Studio, half of the team that had developed ReCore. Back in 2013, Randy had purchased the rights to the Homeworld series from the THQ bankruptcy for $1.35 million. In 2015, they released Homeworld Remastered in partnership with Aspyr Media, one of the largest companies that specialized in porting games. In 2016, Randy would decide that Gearbox should step up and become the Sega, and published their first game, Homeworld Deserts of Karak, from Blackbird Interactive. Blackbird was former Relic Entertainment staffers who had worked on the original Homeworld and Homeworld 2. And finally, Gearbox would go back to producing games, or at least one game, Battleborn. Battleborn was a perfectly fine game that had the unfortunate bad luck to go up against Overwatch in the sales calendar. Despite not being anything like Overwatch, the similarities were enough that gamers felt it was a Battleborn vs. Overwatch fight, instead of seeing them as 2 completely different games. As such, when people went to Overwatch in droves, they also refused to give the other Overwatch a try, and within a year, Battleborn saw concurrent users number below 100. As if that's not bad enough, Randy would get in trouble on Twitter again, this time for tweeting out links to Battleborn porn. While it's likely this was simply a natural feeling tweet to Randy himself, the internet took it as desperation. Various adult websites had recently stated that Overwatch was the #1 most searched for subject on their sites, and the internet decided this was Randy trying to compete. A few months later, Battleborn would go free to play with no further updates coming from Gearbox. This was the last game that Gearbox has developed. The same year as Battleborn, Gearbox would publish Duke Nukem 3D 20th Anniversary World Tour, a port of the original Duke Nukem 3D, including a new level pack produced by 3D Realms. This would only remind everyone of the fight with Gobeil. In 2017, Gearbox got embroiled in one last major controversy. They entered into into a deal with People Can Fly, who's known for creating Painkiller, the game which pro gamer Fatality would win $100,000 in to become the highest paid gamer in the world in 2005. After Painkiller, they were bought by Epic, and co-developed Gears of War 1, 2, and 3, and also co-developed Fortnite. After becoming an independent developer away from Epic, they wanted to produce a remastered version of their game Bulletstorm. The remaster, titled Bulletstorm Full Clip, would be published by Gearbox. The controversy started when Gearbox partnered with the known scammer website G2A. G2A being a company known for facilitating the sale of stolen game keys, dishonest business practices, illegal refund policies, and much, much more. From an outside perspective, Gearbox simply didn't bother doing even a basic Google search before agreeing to partner with this disreputable website. And it was so bad that Total Biscuit pulled all coverage for all Gearbox games. This was only compounded by the price that they were asking. Bulletstorm was originally released in 2011, but in 2017, Gearbox priced the game between $50 and $250. That $250 price tag would get you a physical edition, including a steel case that had been shot with real bullets. The $50 price would get you the game. In an interesting turn, this is the first time Gearbox offered up a ported version of a game with basically no additions at all. The game was essentially just new textures, but otherwise unchanged. This, along with the fact that Gearbox did not upgrade previous owners of the game, or even offer a discounted purchase price, and the only new content was $5 DLC, where you could play as Duke Nukem from Duke Forever, gamers weren't happy. The last nail in this coffin was when Randy would do an interview with IGN, where he would claim not to know Jim Sterling's name.
I remember, what's the name of that guy? He's the journalist guy. His thing is he's always mad. He's a big dude. He's got a British accent. I can't. He's got a hard on for me.
While responding to complaints from Sterling about Gearbox's recent games. Gearbox seems to have enjoyed stepping into this publisher role, however. It's now also publishing Compulsion games We Happy Few. That isn't stopping them from developing more games, however, and there are new games that are on the horizon for Gearbox. Borderlands VR is a PSVR port of Borderlands 2. They're currently working on a Borderlands 3, and there have been rumors circling about a new Brother-in-Arms and a new Duke Nukem title in the coming years. They've also contracted out the movie rights for a Borderlands movie, being produced by Avi Arad, who produced The Amazing Spider-Man 2, and directed by Chris McKay, who directed the Lego Batman movie. There's also been some talk about a Duke Nukem movie starring John Cena. One last Activision fact. It seems Randy still hasn't gotten over the insults thrown at them by Activision staff.
We don't even think about them. Like, that's not the kind of game. They're not a game we even think about when we're playing.
Since he was quick to point out that Call of Duty World War II seems to have taken Brothers-in-Arms, Hell's Highways cover art and replicated it. Perhaps most interestingly, Activision didn't give them any credit at all. But I'm sure it was just an homage, an inspiration. He should be flattered, if anything. What is your experience with Gearbox? What's your favorite game from them? Let me know in the comments. I'd really love to hear your input. If you like this video, please consider sharing it. It's the only way a small content creator like ourselves can grow. If you didn't, then don't. But if you did, you can watch another in the corner right now. And as always, we'll see you on the next one.